2022 is the year science fiction is definitely making a big comeback for me, and that comeback continues very strongly with Elder Race.
Liness is the lowly fourth daughter of the queen, and always getting in the way. But a demon is terrorizing the land, and now she's an adult, albeit barely, and though she still gets in the way, she understands that the only way to save her people is to invoke the pact between her family and the elder sorcerer who has inhabited the local tower for as long as her people have lived here, though none in living memory has approached it. But Elder Nier isn't a sorcerer, and he is forbidden to help, for his knowledge of science tells him the threat cannot possibly be a demon.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Andrew's Book Corner. Today I'm doing a review for Adrian Tchaikovsky's Elder Race. So this is a very cool book. I really liked this book. And essentially it's a sci-fi fantasy novella. And that's kind of an interesting thing right away. So it's almost 200 pages, right? It's 180 pages. In most genres, that's a novel. But in sci-fi and especially fantasy, that's really short. The genre is kind of somewhat obsessed right now with kind of writing as big a book as you can. So this is, if you're reading a lot of those bigger sci-fi fantasy books, this can be a really nice, refreshing, quick read. And if you're new to the genre and are intimidated by a lot of those bigger books and series like Brandon Sanderson or things like that, then this could be a really nice entry point. So this book, written in 2021, it's kind of a really interesting midpoint for Adrian Tchaikovsky. And so, full honesty, this is the only book by Tchaikovsky I've read so far. I have a few of his other books, and I really want to get to them soon. But from what I can tell and from what I've read about him in his career, he started quite firmly planted in the fantasy genre, with his first series being the Shadow of the Apt series. Which is very much fantasy about humanity, which has grown up alongside different totem insects. So there's the ant people who can communicate telepathically, right? They have like an ant hive mind. Or there's the beetle people that have kind of abilities similar to beetles and all these things. But in that series, there seems to be also quite a strong technological kind of, through line, right? Like there's kind of a technology present and it develops through the series. And so I think that scientific technological through line carried him through to now his kind of current career is very much sci-fi focused, with books like Children of Time, Doors of Eden, and Shards of Earth. So his books now are very much sci-fi. And so I think this Elder Race is a really interesting kind of moment in his career because it offers a really unique blending of science fiction and fantasy. Now, I don't mean that it's science fantasy, in the sense of like C.S. Friedman's The Cold Fire trilogy, or even more recently Tamsin Muir's Gideon the Ninth and Harrow the Ninth. It's not that. It's not that it's a blending of sci-fi and fantasy coming together. It's actually through a narrative device that he uses, specifically through point of view, that it ends up telling the same story, but one version of the story is a fantasy story and one version is a sci-fi story. So, as I mentioned from reading the back, the story follows a young woman called Liness, who is a princess of this kind of kingdom, and she journeys to this mysterious, ancient tower, which is home to an ancient powerful sorcerer, and she goes there to essentially invoke an ancient pact between this sorcerer and her family to help defeat this new kind of demon that is stalking and terrorizing the land. So roughly half the chapters are told from Liness's point of view and half of them are told from Nier's point of view. And what this means is that, we realize that Nier is not actually a sorcerer. He's actually an anthropologist from old Earth, in kind of bygone era of technological advancement. And so what this means is that, from one point of view, you're reading a very firmly planted fantasy story. And from another, you're reading a very firmly planted science fiction story, right? About stellar colonization and anthropology. So one thing that this kind of difference between perspective gives us is this idea of technology versus magic, right? Because, all of these things that Nier is able to do just look like magic to Linnes and the other characters. But when you're reading it from Nier's point of view, you realize that it's satellites and it's drones and it's kind of bio enhancements that he's done to himself, right? So it's very firmly, hard sci-fi in that way. And this gets to like a really interesting and fundamental kind of truism almost of science fiction. And it goes back to one of Arthur C. Clarke's kind of 3 laws of sci-fi and fantasy. And so Clarke says that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's a big thing in this book, because no matter how much we see, how technology driven the world is, or Nier is through his point of view, from Linnes's point of view, it's just magic. There's no other explanation for it. And so that's really interesting. And this also gets to this point about anthropology, right? And so the book is in a lot of ways a critique of anthropology, which I really appreciated and liked, because Nier is an anthropologist, and as he describes himself, he's not a very good one, and he's also the last one, because he was of a group of anthropologists on this planet, and most of them had to leave for some reason, so he's now the only one left. And so this gets to 2 interesting points, one about anthropology and one about his character. So the anthropological point is, this kind of deconstruction of anthropology's objectiveness, or objectivity, right? And so, and also how difficult it becomes to actually understand a people and what their actions mean to them if you're not part of that group, right? There's a great scene where, because he's speaking kind of an old Earth dialect because of his age, he sounds very alien to Linnes and the other characters. So he can't, on a kind of an intrinsic communication level, he can't even, articulate himself in a way that can dispel their beliefs about him. So when he's trying to explain to them that he's not a magician, he's a scientist, or he's a scholar, these words in this new dialect that has risen on this planet all kind of mean the same thing. So it sounds like he's saying, I'm not a magician, I'm merely a magician, And so it gets to this really interesting point of how do you actually overcome communication barriers when they're that intrinsic or kind of, untraversable. And then in terms of the objectivity of anthropology, it does a really great job of saying, who is the study for, right? Like, why are you studying this group of people, and who will that benefit? It's definitely not going to benefit the people you're studying, right? Especially in this book, there's this kind of demon stalking the land, and his anthropological training would say, well, you can't get involved, you need to watch, and if they all die, then that's great for the study, right? Like, it's tragic, but at least you can take notes on it. And so the book is him kind of coming to terms with this, and he's saying, well, why? Who is that benefiting? I'm the only anthropologist left, right? I'm not reporting it back to anyone, and these are the only other people around, and if I'm not helping them, what am I doing, right? So it's this really good deconstruction of anthropology. So then this leads me to one of the weaknesses of the book, and my only kind of real kind of complaint about the book, which is characters. And I think characters actually show a real strength of the book and a weakness of the book. So I found that Linnes was a little underdeveloped. She's definitely got personality, she's got motives, you understand why she's doing the things she's doing, you understand where she's coming from, and you do sympathize with her. But I found her chapters a bit more dry and a little difficult to relate to. Whereas then Nier, you actually really get a sense of this character essentially just dealing with brutal loneliness, depression, and kind of existential crises. So through him, you really get a sense of Tchaikovsky's character work, being the last anthropologist of this outpost, being essentially ancient, doing this menial task of taking notes and trying to report everything and trying to come up with hypotheses, even though he will never report it to anyone again. And so it's him kind of dealing with this existential crisis of, well, why am I alive? Why am I continuing to do this job? and working through essentially just depression and loneliness. And again, this is a great little moment of the difference between the point of views, right? So one of the kind of scientific aspects of this book is he's got kind of an emotion inhibitor installed in him. And so during the days when it's on, it allows him to deal with things, you know, with less emotion, to try to make more logical decisions. But he needs to kind of vent it, right? He needs to like let the steam out, essentially. So every now and then he needs to let it down and kind of really deal with his emotions all at once. And so he describes this, and he's trying to describe it scientifically, but the language is something like, oh, there's this beast that comes for me every night, right? And so to Linnes and the other characters, there's this wild beast, there's this creature that stalks and hunts out sorcerers. But to him, he's really talking about, you know, kind of an inner beast of depression and trauma and loneliness, right? And so again, it's just a really great example of how having this story told in two genres essentially really shows you different things about the characters, and how the same situation is viewed by different characters. So anyway, that's Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Incredible book. I don't really have a rating system, but 5 out of 5. Incredible book for someone like me who reads a lot of fantasy and science fiction. Very cool blending of both, and also quite a refreshing book in terms of its size. And yeah, if you're looking to get into science fiction or fantasy, I think this would be a great entry point, because it shows you, you know, really well what both can do, and it's quite a short, quick read. So yeah, I'm thrilled with this book. Very excited to read more Tchaikovsky. And yeah, if you've read it, let me know. And yeah, thanks for checking in. I'll be back soon with more videos.